All right, I think it looks like we're leveling off and folks joining us. So welcome to everyone joining us for July Marketo office hours. I'm Jessica Myers and I'm the host. I'm gonna start with a couple of introductions of our awesome panelists here, jump into some housekeeping items, and then we'll get to why you're all really here, which is the fantastic questions that were submitted ahead of time. As always, if you haven't joined office hours, feel free to drop questions in the chat as they come up as our panelists are talking about things. We want this to be an engaging and collaborative session. As I mentioned, I'm Jessica. I'm the Director of Marketing Operations and Technology at Tebra. I'm a first-year Marketo champion. I'm the host and moderator of today's panel. I'm joined by four incredible panelists, and I'll let them each give a quick introduction. Heather, since you're first on the screen, do you want to start?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Heather Harris. I'm a manager of email and automation for Phreesia, and I'm a 2 times certified expert and Adobe champion. And yeah, it's been fantastic being in the champion program.
Evan?
Hey y'all, Evan Kubitschek, founder and principal consultant at Revenue Ronin. I am 3 times certified, and this is also my first year as a Marketo champion. Nice to meet y'all.
Andy?
Hey everybody, this is Andy Caron. I'm the SVP of Consulting at Revenue Pulse. I have been Marketo certified since 2013. I'm MCSA. I run the user group here in Chicago, where I'm based, and Marketo is my happy place.
You bleed purple. And last but not certainly not least, Joy.
Hey guys, Joy Martinez, Senior Director of Marketing Ops at CS2 Marketing. Similar to Andy, I've been certified since 2013 and also a solution architect as well, and first time champion this year. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Joy. All right. Quick agenda. We'll do some house rules, some housekeeping. I'll cover off, I think we have some upcoming opportunities, but I may be wrong there. And then we'll jump into the Q&A. I'll try and breeze through this first part so we can get to the meat pretty quickly. Awesome. House rules. So Champ office hours are our user group, and we try and keep them a safe space for members of the Marketing Nation to learn, network, and problem solve. As a quick rule, no self-promotion or pitching of any kind is allowed. I know all of our champs here are generally helpful, but make sure that they give consent before contacting them outside of this. And then if they share their specific use case or specific information on how they've set something up, please don't share that information without consent. We are recording this. If you don't wish to be recorded, please let us know. These are hosted and shared on our YouTube channel for further learning. Stay connected. We want to make sure that you're getting all the latest and greatest content from our champion office hours, which happen about monthly. Make sure you've joined the champion office hours mug group to stay in the loop about upcoming events. All right, there's no upcoming events because we're about to switch over to a new champion class, and office hours will resume shortly after that. But the one quick update I have is there's now 3 options for the certification. The Adobe Certified Professional, which is formerly the Associate, the Adobe Certified Expert, which is formerly the Marketo Certified Expert, and then the formerly MCSA, now called Adobe Marketo Engage Architect. It's just as much of a mouthful now. And it's a newer certification that's designed for people, at the highest levels of consulting. And I think there's a couple of us on this call that have that certification. The deck will be shared out, but you can always visit this link for more info. Awesome. I'm going to go back to our panel screen here, and we're going to jump into the Q&A. And I'm going to leave it on our panel screen so that you guys can double see all of our lovely faces. All right. Kicking things off, I'm going to start off with a question that I think will be fun to have all of our panelists chime in on, but I'm going to start with Joy. And I'd love some recommendations from our whole panel on best practices to document your Marketo instance, because let's be real, most of us probably don't have it as documented as we'd like.
Yeah, I know. Everybody's always looking for documentation, right? I mean, documenting in general, all of your key processes, let alone what's in Marketo, is definitely, crucial, whether you're in consulting or in-house, right? And so I guess a place that I like to start is like, don't overcomplicate it. Like, you don't have to have like a Confluence or a Notion. I mean, those kind of systems are great. They create great searchability and stuff, but you can do a lot of simple things just in Google Docs. I typically like to capture things in my documentation, like any discovery that we did, any kind of auditing that we maybe did as part of the project or part of what's set up, use cases, initial findings that we're seeing, discussions, or even like linking call recordings that might be crucial, so that you can keep track of like why decisions were made and not just, what was chatted about and stuff, and dependencies and things to think through. And then also just like thinking through and documenting your strategy, and you're thinking of, why you created it the way that you did. And then, actually documenting your build as well. So, links to anything, screenshots are also great, and, definitely help for a quick visual of what's going on if you don't want to like click into every single link and like actually go into Marketo and stuff. And then any like supporting documents that you might create, right? That you might have like workbooks or, PowerPoint presentations that you've done or things like that, that you would want to include in the build. And then the last piece that I like to always include as well is like next steps. Like, usually there's always like ongoing monitoring that you're doing, or maybe this was just phase 1 and you've already started to think through like what might need to happen in phase 2 or phase 3, or maybe you have like a certain monitoring cadence or frequency, and you're gonna come back at the next quarter and add on and refresh. So just keeping it as thorough as you can. I also like to include like who were the key stakeholders that made those decisions, and what their roles were in the process, so that way if the process or the documentation needs to update, if you make system updates, you always know like which teams maybe are going to be impacted by those changes that you need to loop back in if you make changes later. So that's where I'd start.
That's such a good recommendation. And I definitely see some folks chiming in chat about how much they love keeping track of the why. And as somebody who's inherited a Marketo instance, I can say I wish I had had that when I got my Marketo instance. I'd love to hear from maybe some of our other panelists on their thoughts about documenting a Marketo instance as well. Andy, I saw you nod. Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I can hop in here. So as far as keeping track of the why, I typically actually keep a spreadsheet. I know it's mundane, but a Google Drive spreadsheet is something that will persist after I maybe get promoted or win the lottery or whatever inside the organization. And so I do keep a change log. And in there, I put everything from, added new field in Salesforce is intended to be controlled in Salesforce, but read for segmentation or whatever I'm using it for, to, implemented lifecycle changes or implemented a new lifecycle, and then link out to sub documentation for that specific thing. In there, I also have columns for future state, like things to be mindful of. So if you're changing this, you're going to also have to think about this. I can search through the document and look for that when I'm going forward. Other implications, basically, is kind of an implications column. My practice, my favorite thing to do with documentation these days is I love video documentation. I think being able to see what's happening inside the screen and actually do the step-by-step is super powerful. But if you are onboarding someone new, or you're, being promoted and bringing in additional people in your team, handing them a folder of 40 videos that are 30 minutes a piece is not conquerable. And so what I've started doing is taking that training, or any training that I do, or any other walkthroughs or video documentation, and I put it into a transcription process. Take that transcription, put it into ChatGPT, tell it to use Marketo parlance, and have it give me a step-by-step process. And that goes into my documentation along with the video, so that I have a 20, 30, 40-step process on need to make a change to my life cycle, need to launch a webinar, whatever it is, that is a step-by-step follow through, a little bit of editing, done.
Andy, you teed up the next question I want to ask perfectly, which I feel like you can't be anywhere these days in tech and not be hearing about generative AI or AI in some way, form, or fashion. So what are our panelists' thoughts on generative AI, ChatGPT, et cetera? Will it increase productivity? What concerns do you have around it maybe decreasing manpower for the future?
I love this question. Can I take my minute first? I know I just answered. So I think that there's a couple ways that this can go. And in our current style of economy, I kind of think I know where it's going to go and I don't love it. But as a leader within my organization, the conversations I've been driving forward about AI is, what can it help accelerate for us? What can it take off of our plate that's currently difficult, tricky, and simplify? And how do we look at increasing productivity and improving the lives of our employees without making them redundant? And I think that's the key thing, is that AI is an accelerator. It's a companion to the brilliance of the person. And so training someone how to actually use AI and think about it as a way to accelerate the work that they're doing, take load off of stuff they don't want to do or they're too busy for, is great. But as a company, we can't be thinking about, oh, we can now do this with 4 people and still have them working at 50, 60 hours a week. We have to think about the fact that we can keep them at 40 hours a week, or maybe even have them work 35 and get 60 hours of billable work or whatever it is out of their time, right? And how do we as an organization set the baseline for making that the culture? And I think if corporate culture doesn't trend in that way, we're going to have a little bit of a challenge. But if they do, if they look at it from a perspective of how do we have happier employees, longer retention of employees, all those types of things, along with being better at our jobs and doing better, then that tees up everyone to be in a successful place.
Evan, did I see you come off mute to chime in around AI as well?
Yeah. So, up until recently, we had kind of a skunkworks division on figuring out how to take advantage of AI in the context of the entire company. And to Andy's point, I think you have to look at it as a force multiplier rather than a wholesale replacement for individuals. I think one key point that you have to keep in mind, especially for a lot of the use cases right now, use AI to write your content, use AI to replace blah, blah, blah. It's trained on snapshots in time that are in the past. So it is not a wholesale replacement for creativity, for the human touch. It is a fantastic tool for brainstorming, for giving you ideas, for thinking about how other people are doing things, because you can query it in a way that isn't as easy to get to via a Google search or another search engine. But I think you have to be very careful about what it can and cannot do, and put those use cases into documentation for your team. I think having a coherent strategy for how the team should use these new models and these new tools is half the battle. Until we built those teams to evaluate how we could use it as a company, you had one-off use cases, individuals paying for their own license of ChatGPT, playing around, and we really didn't see any team-wide, marketing org-wide time savings or efficiency gains until we actually put a strategy on it and put a team on it. And I think that's a key piece of how you succeed with them.
I love that. It's definitely a topic that comes up so frequently now. And I think it's so interesting to hear everyone's perspectives on. Does anyone else want to chime in on AI, or are we good if I take us in a slightly different direction? We had a number of questions submitted by folks who registered around some of the new Marketo certifications. I'd love to hear from some of our panelists on some of the thoughts and prep work they've put into preparing for their Marketo certifications. And I think, Heather, you want to start?
Yeah, I would say the study guide that is available online is a great place to start. I mean, just being very familiar with the topics that are on there. If there's anything that you don't feel 100% about, just keep revisiting that and make sure that you do understand it. I think all of the topics that are on the study guide, the current one, are great topics. And yeah, just going through each of those topics and taking the practice test over and over again is great. And if there's something you feel unsure about, the community is also a great resource to surf to find those answers.
Does one of our folks who has their architect exam want to chime in?
Yes, I can say something here. So I am a huge fan of taking the test to take the test and seeing how you do. You might pass it, or you might almost pass it, in which case you know what you need to improve. Instead of trying to spend hours and hours and hours figuring out what you need to know to take the test, take the test. I know it might be some money out of pocket, but that personal investment and the time to actually take it is probably going to get you a lot further. And shocker, you might actually pass it. Because I think a lot of us tend to assume like, oh, I don't know everything. I'm not smart enough. I don't have what it takes. Don't assume, because if you assume that, then by default, you won't be certified. You won't pass the test because you're never going to take it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's nice to look, I mean, anticipate what's going to be on there, look at the study guides and stuff, but I've seen some people get really panicked and nervous about it and like really stress over it. And it's really nothing to stop your life for, you know? And yeah, like you'd be surprised, I think, after actually taking it. And then when you do take it, even if you don't pass, like you now have a different comfort level of like, oh, okay, like we'll just count that as another practice. I've seen what to expect. And now I know kind of the areas to go back and dig into. And I know that I've, especially like early on, when I did a bit more studying for it, now I, kind of just show up, which is probably not the best advice, but back in the day when I studied for it a lot more and stuff, like I love Marketo's documentation. Like, if you're wanting to dig into areas and stuff like that, like do read and reference the documentation in addition to the study guide on the areas you're getting stuck in, because it's definitely really straightforward and helpful. And then if that's also not, reach out to the community, reach out in Slack groups, see if you can, even just spend some time just practicing this stuff in your instance. So.
Yeah, I would echo that, in that a lot of the stuff that is going to show up on the exam, even if you don't specifically study it via the study guide, you're going to get it through osmosis, just using the platform. There really is no replacement for experience. I know, I've seen with colleagues, there's a lot of pressure to get an MCE within 6 months or something like that of it introducing themselves to the platform. And that is hard. That is where you need the study guide, the practice tests. But if you've been in the platform, you're in there day in and day out, and you supplement a little bit of studying with just referring to the documentation on a daily basis, you're going to get there pretty quickly. So I think if you are just in there every day, you take a look at the study guide, you reference areas that maybe you don't use every day. For example, I was weaker on the reporting side because we had really robust Salesforce reports, Looker reports. So I didn't use the reports daily. That's when you can refer to the documentation. If you shore up any weak spots or things you don't use every day in your own instance, you'll get there really fast.
I think one really tactical or practical note, if you're trying to make the jump from taking the MCE to the architect exam, I would just say be prepared for a lot of reading. The questions are beefy, and there's case studies in the new architect exam. So if you've taken the MCE a few times and are looking to make the jump, be prepared for a little bit longer of a test with a little bit, and AKA a lot more reading than you might be used to on the MCE. And I would also say, my other tactical or practical tip is to read the questions and make sure you really read the questions and really read the answers on all of the Marketo exams. Sometimes, we all know this in ops, but a slight wording difference can mean the correct answer versus the incorrect answer. Awesome. Moving on a little bit from certifications into some kind of tracking questions. How are folks on our panel handling person source traffic on their website when it comes to direct website traffic versus organic search? Hot topic, as I'm sure everyone's trying to cut costs and get more leads through organic right now. I think Joy, want to take this one?
I can start, and if anybody else wants to chime in. Yeah, I mean, I've done this over and over and over again with clients, even as recently as today, I was working on one of these projects. I mean, a lot of them will use a custom web script that they apply on their site to be able to track. If there are URL parameters, it'll stamp it into the cookie, into the UTM source, medium, and campaign values, for example. And then if there is no URL parameters present, it can look at the referring URL. So you can work with a web developer to, create a custom JavaScript to place on your site and be able to store that information into the cookie. And then to actually get that information passed over to Marketo, you're adding your UTM source, medium, campaign term, content, whatever UTM fields you have as hidden fields on your forms, and pull from the cookie value. And then those will pass through. You will need like sorry, big bang in my house. You'll need an operational campaign to handle some stamping. I personally love to use executable campaigns for person source stamping as part of a more centralized order of operations, so that we can control when the stamping happens. Some of my clients will actually hard code on their website like a lead source program latest field. So you know exactly when the form is filled out, and the lead source program latest is this, that will pull it into the correct Marketo campaign. But then to actually set like the lead source latest and lead source detail latest, for example, you may have different naming conventions for the fields. You would need like an operational campaign to listen for different UTM values to come in and then update those lead source fields with those UTM values. So for example, somebody comes from organic social on LinkedIn and they click from one of your posts, the referring URL should be able to capture in the cookie that is coming from organic social and LinkedIn as the medium. And then your operational campaign is listening for that and will stamp it accordingly. We have some clients kind of take it a step further and stamp their UTMs on their campaign member object in Salesforce, which is helpful because it kind of answers the where and the what conversation, like where did they convert and what did they convert on? And so you know that they came from organic social, they came from LinkedIn, and they converted on XYZ white paper. And it makes it very easy to do lead source reporting. So some of our clients do first touch lead source reporting. Some do tipping point, which is when the life cycle or MQL happens. We've got various, depending on the use cases, but those are just some of the key things that I set up in Marketo and would consider. But any other details are probably getting too detailed for the call. So anybody else has any high level advice, feel free to chime in.
The only thing I'll layer in there is if you're using a script to push the UTMs on at the time of form complete instead of relying on hidden fields, there's an additional layer to that script, especially with Google Analytics, where you can pull the organic information where UTMs are not present and you're persisting it across multiple pages and layer that in so you can get that it was Google and organic without UTMs or other data points like that to pull that in as well. And then you don't just have like website as a source, right?
Perfect. I love this one. I think, yeah, trends in the industry are shifting, more and more people are trying to invest more and more in generating, more organic traffic and organic volume. And it's interesting to see how different folks are making sure that that's represented in all of their source reporting. Pivoting a little bit, because I think we kind of touched on this, and you mentioned something, Joy, that I think a lot of people use to deal with this. How are folks on the panel dealing with scenarios in their instance where they have racing smart campaigns? And if you're in the audience and aren't familiar with the term racing, it's usually used in Marketo land to mean when stuff happens out of order or not in the order that you intend it, or somebody processes through a program before all the upstream data that's appended that would make them successfully navigate through that program is on their record. So I'd love to hear from folks on the panel on how they're addressing that. And Joy, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sorry, I was typing in the chat. I was half listening to the question. Could you ask
How do you
it one more
handle
time, or have somebody else start it, and then I'll... Oh, the racing smart campaigns. Yeah. So, well, I mean, I guess going off of what I just said, the executable campaigns at first, when executable campaigns came out, I was like, what are the use cases? Like, how are people using these executable campaigns? And I think we all were wondering like what really they were. But they're amazing, you know, because a lot of people, I'll find like a lot of request campaigns set up in their instances when we go in for the first time, you know, which are okay here and there. But what happens is, you know, when things can request, it doesn't wait for that step to finish before it goes on to the next flow step. So you end up potentially creating these race conditions where a bunch of things are firing at the same time, and therefore things are happening not in the order that you would expect. And so the way executable campaigns work is, you know, you have a flow step, you tell it to do this thing, it finishes that thing before it moves to the next thing, and then that finishes before it moves to the next thing. And so you can control exactly what happens. And so like a new lead comes in the system, let's say you want it to run through normalization first. We've even kind of rigged it up where you can do enrichment first, wait for it to listen. If it hasn't been enriched, we loop back another minute. But basically you can do like normalization, do your lead sourcing, then scoring, then life cycle, then sync to Salesforce. Like you can literally set up the exact order of your operational processing that you want to happen with executable campaigns. And it helps prevent race conditions. They're also a lot more efficient on your system as a whole. It's a lot faster processing and stuff, so you won't have as much campaign queue backup and processing load using executable campaigns. I just find them a lot more efficient than trigger campaigns and stuff like that. So any kind of operational, anything that's in your operational folder today in Marketo, most of the time could be moved to an executable campaign and just make your instance run a lot smoother. And then when people are concerned about, you know, speed to lead or speed to meeting, and they're trying to get those leads as fast as they can over into sales hands, having that efficient processing is really important, and ensuring too that all the correct things happen before that person gets routed, or it may end up going to the wrong team, or they're going to be like, where's this information? And there's a lot of bouncing back between Salesforce and Marketo. So yeah, use executable campaigns for all of that to solve your issues.
The other thing that I like to do is look at or do an audit of where I have multiple things triggering off of the same type of event, and see if that can be consolidated or put into, I like to call it like a sorting hat, or like a prioritization, depending on what's happening. I know my nerd is showing, but if you're looking at something like lead source, if you have lead is created and then this qualifier, and lead is created and that qualifier, and they qualify for both, right? It doesn't set priority. So they could be running through both, and you might have a challenge there where it ends up with the wrong data. You have a single smart campaign that says lead is created, and then you use your choices in your flow step to determine where they process based on that prioritization, whether it's a smart list set of criteria or other things. That mitigates that sort of dueling banjos thing that you can get. And then the other thing with executable campaigns, Joy, you're exactly right, is that it has that wait step almost built in, right? Because it doesn't go to the next step until that's done, which can cause challenges if something's broken and it's not actually completing it, right? So if it's like trying to do the thing and it can't, that's an oops, you need to fix it. Guess you know then, right? But you don't have to build in that like wait 30 seconds, wait 1 minute, wait blah, 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 because the system's actually going to process faster than the wait steps you might try to build in to like safeguard yourself. And then try to do the dry methodology. I know, there's some champs that are huge proponents of this, but like the don't repeat yourself methodology. Look for places where you're repeating yourself and then simplify it. See what you can do to mitigate some of those race conditions based on everybody acting on the same thing. You're not going to have 14 people able to catch one ball you're throwing, right?
I'll add on to join Andy. I think they're absolutely correct. We were huge proponents of executable campaigns at my last company, and one element that we added to the end of that is a static list membership to indicate whether or not a success status has been imputed by the executable. You can also use Boolean fields to indicate whether or not they've made it through processing, and that can actually trigger other steps within your instance. But one extra step that you can take is taking a look at membership to determine list membership to determine, did they make it through your lead lifecycle process, your enrichment process? Are there people that have gotten hung up somehow? It makes it much easier to do kind of a daily maintenance check of how did people fall out of the system? Are there gaps or sort of conditions that I didn't account for in my build? But when you build that extra step in, it makes it much easier to diagnose things than having to play Sherlock Holmes and go into an activity feed and look at race conditions and figure out what happened to an individual as they made it through a bunch of request campaigns.
I love that. Our new, and it's something we recently launched at my org, central processing program has a like automatic filter that if they haven't completed the first step, which is the only one that needs to happen in order in a certain amount of time, it sends us an alert and then it just moves them on anyways, to avoid some of what Andy was talking about, where sometimes people don't finish and that's something you need to go address. So building safeguards in for that's really helpful. Awesome. I want to talk a little bit about opt-in, which I know is a topic that I'm going to always preface this with saying, consult with your legal team about anything related to compliance and opt-in, because that's the most important answer is what your legal team tells you. But we have a question around B2B compliance in the US. So if a person's opted out of email and then changes company, should that opt-out be reset or be retained for their new company? And I'm curious how champs have handled situations like that in the past.
And
Heather,
I can jump in. Yeah.
Perfect.
Reset it if they've moved to a new company and email address has changed. It is okay to reset it so they can receive communications again, as long as the new email is not on the unsubscribe list. But yeah, reset it.
Yeah, I take that same approach.
Worth noting that it's, go ahead, Evan.
I was just going to note it's extraordinarily difficult to track those types of changes unless you're paying for some expensive tools that allow you to do that. Yeah. And so, to my mind, to track those types of preferences, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, because you're probably going to see in the neighborhood of tens to dozens of these cases in a given year, and you're not running afoul of any regulations by doing that if it's a net new email and you don't have a durable unsubscribe on it. So all that to say, I agree. Definitely let it ride.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I love it. Let's talk a little bit about lead scoring. And we've got a couple of questions around lead scoring that I'd love to hear for some folks on. So first question, and this is a beefy one, but how are folks handling scenarios where there's multi-product interest at their org or within orgs they've worked with, specifically both from a lead scoring and a lead lifecycle standpoint? Andy, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So I think the first thing that I want to know when I'm coming into this kind of scenario is, when we're talking about multi-product, is this a scenario where one product's selling to a completely different, industry demographic set, or are they both selling to the same people? Because that's going to change how I set things up. And then are they in an environment where it is workspaces and partitions, or is it all just in one default workspace? Because that's also going to change the structure of how I think about this. So the first thing that I want to understand is if we're all collectively selling to the same people, can they simultaneously MQL for multiple products? Or is the MQL then everyone else is hands off and they're only buying that one thing? Is the sales team handling selling all the things, or is it routing to different sales teams? Because all of those different complexities are going to change how I structure. But at the end of the day, you need distinction on how you score. So way back in the day, it was like 2016, I inherited an instance with 5 life cycles and 5 scoring models for 5 different product sets. And what they didn't do was differentiate what was what. So scoring for opening an email was happening on all 5 scoring models and all 5 life cycles for any email that was open, regardless of what brand. And so you have to think about this in sort of a 4th dimension on how you're handling this. So you can look at tags and other sort of fancy ways. You can go down the partitions and workspaces piece, but you're still going to have to think about how you're really categorizing things. My experience, the easiest way to determine what goes where is actually to focus on having a really concrete naming convention on your programs, where you can say this is this product, or this is this business, or this sub brand, or whatever it is. And then if the program status is changing, which is my preferred methodology for most scoring, occurs, and it has this bracket 3-number code or whatever, right? Then it goes to this brand or it goes here. The other thing is, if an MQL is an MQL is an MQL, and they might be buying 10, 20, 50 different products, what I like to do then is focus on having one life cycle. I don't want distinctive ones. And then I build out scoring for each of those areas where there's interest. And instead of using a numeric value, I do a low, medium, high. So that way, when the salesperson gets the lead, they can go in and look at those rankings in a separate area on the contact or account, whatever I'm doing at a sales level, to say, okay, so I'm rolling this up to the account. I've done some Salesforce work to gather that up there, or I'm doing it on the contact or the lead, to say their interest is high in product A, low in product B, high in product C, or whatever it is, so that they know then what to package sell. But I think at the end of the day, you need to be able to determine what behavior goes with what brand and distinctly, clearly tie that in the system so that there's no blurred lines on what's happening. Anyone else, please chime in. I'm sure there's so much.
I would definitely echo that, in that selling to multiple product lines, you have to have, probably more so than your standard bi-dimensional scoring model, you really have to have ironclad requirements, and you have to have very strong buy-in from product leaders, from sales leaders, from marketing leaders. This is one of those scenarios where you absolutely cannot build the basics in a vacuum. You have to involve all of those stakeholders and make it an ongoing conversation. And to Andy's point, we did something very similar across 4 product lines, rolling it up to the account record at the account level, and letting sales see kind of those rolling numbers by product line. And we didn't actually build that in Marketo. There were elements of it, but it was a predictive scoring model. So this is one of those cases where you might want to rely, if you have an internal data team, looking at predictive as a potential path, especially as you add these layers of complexity. But I think to start, absolutely, you have to have ironclad, agreed upon requirements from all your major stakeholders.
I'm just going to add in I agree with everything you guys have both said. The only thing I would just want to highlight is, especially when we get to more complex scoring models like that, like just ensuring that you guys are doing some UAT and testing and considering, is this going live now? What is our batching plan for our existing database? Do we want to look at the past 30 days and batch them into the new scoring model? Think through all of that, because to Andy's point, or the example that she gave where it was like the same thing in all 5 scoring models, you're not going to find that unless you're doing really good, thorough QA and stuff. So just ensure too that, you know, in addition to bringing in, you know, everybody for the requirement gathering piece and gaining alignment, that you're also doing enablement on the back end as well. So I'll just always preach training and enablement all day long.
I want to add to that, Joy. I think one thing with UAT that I've seen orgs get tripped up on in the past is they test very specific scenarios and confirm that very specific scenarios work, and don't necessarily think about how a person may flow through their marketing IRL. And so they'll give a bunch of points for disparate activities. But when you think about it, it's like opened an email is 1 point, clicked an email is 1 point, visited a web page is another point, then filled out a form. And it's like probably they all compound, and they don't necessarily think about how activities may stack on each other. So I would suggest that you write out some like real world scenarios about how a person may engage with specific marketing, and go through those paths once you're testing your scoring model, and see how the different behaviors stack on each other.
Along those lines, one of my favorite things to do when I'm implementing new scoring, especially if it's going to be deprecating old scoring and bringing in new, is I'll build the model, and actually, if I can, let it run for a month or 2 months or 3 months. And I'll compare what would have gone to sales versus what did go to sales. And I may even A/B test at the end and still have both running concurrently. So it's like our A model, our old model runs, and then anything that's delta that didn't run but would have qualified on the B model also goes. And then I can test conversion for how those leads performed against each other if I want to.
I loved that when I did it. It was such a fun project. Okay, so kind of moving on from multi-product to another scoring question that I think is also really relevant. How are folks on the panel handling scenarios where a person has maybe garnered a really high score in the past by engaging with a lot of marketing material, but is now no longer active? Are you doing anything to deprecate that score or reset to reflect their current activity levels? And I see a lot of nods, so I'm imagining that most folks are doing this. Who wants to take this one?
I actually set every single scoring model where it's approved to do so to have a window, and the score rolls on, and then 90 days later or 180 days later, whatever the sales cycle is, that score then rolls off again. So if they get 5 points, 90 days later, they lose the 5 points, 10 points, so on and so forth. And that mitigates me having a, you know, like take away 5 points after 30 days of an activity or whatever challenge, right? Because maybe they only had 4 points. Maybe they had 5,000 points. It makes it a more relative and managed score that I can actually wrap my arms around, as opposed to this in perpetuity, eternal, like doesn't mean anything imaginary number score.
Yeah, I'll just add into kind of going off of that. I mean, if you're going to build in decay, one thing I just ensure is that like you're not going negative. I usually always stop everything at 0. So like if they only have 4 points today and you're trying to subtract 5, it still just brings it down to 0. Don't let it go negative, because I once had a client that had like negative 40,000 like points on a person, and it was like, geez, this person's never going to have a chance of MQLing again in their lifetime, because they have to go way up just to get over 0 again. So that's easy to miss if you don't set it up properly. So just ensure that you are accounting for you know, data value and score changes to like not go below 0. And then also, this is sort of not related, but also related to scoring with if you are going to recycle a lead. So let's say something does move forward in MQL at some point and sales is done working it, they haven't found it successful and they recycle it. Or if you, I have some clients that like, if they stay in a working status for like 60 days and they haven't progressed forward, it'll move it back to recycled, that you reset that behavior at that time too. It's sort of a good chance to just refresh at that time too.
Yeah, I'll add just kind of the inverse of that, not necessarily decay, but also be very careful about how you trigger positive scoring on activity. So for example, I've stepped into instances where they had a basic behavior score that updated for any form fill which it's not great if you send people who are unsubscribing and angry about your marketing to sales, as an example. So always make sure you're checking whether or not the activity is actually positive reinforcement around your marketing, and whether or not that should be passed to sales or passed further down your funnel.
So much nuance around score. And I think Andy made a really good point about what works for your business and taking your sales cycle into account. And I think that's definitely one that I want to echo for everyone in the audience. If you haven't heard, Marketo's releasing later this year their new engagement canvas, which will allow for some visual flows of smart campaigns. We had a couple of people want to hear the champ's thoughts on the new engagement canvas and what parts of the new engagement canvas they're most excited about. Heather, you want to start?
Yeah, so I was able to see a demo of this a few weeks back, and it's really cool. It's a different visual. It is a visual on what is happening in any given program, and you can identify drop-off points. Was there an email did we send an email after this form fill? What happens with this person next in this program? Where are they going? I mean, I don't know if anybody else is like me, but in the past or still currently, I sometimes will take a screenshot of a campaign setup just to add some extra color around like what is actually happening with the person. Here are the filters in place. Well, with Engagement Canvas, it's just one view. It's like a visual of everything that's happening, which I think is awesome. It's great for people that are not familiar with Marketo, like stakeholders. So it's really helpful for them, I think. And then it also, all of your folders and all of the, like the layout and the structure of all that stuff will not change. So it's just a different view that you'll have, which will be really, really nice. But yeah, I think it's going to be great.
Yeah, I think everybody like learns differently too. So like, I feel like a lot of us ops folks, like, you know, we work in Marketo with the flow the way it is, and like we're so used to it and ingrained in it. But like anybody outside of MOPS might not think that way or visualize in that way. So I think it's going to be really nice for documentation and just for enablement and just general understanding outside of, you know, marketing or RevOps to just understand what's going on. I think that's a key win, but then still having the flexibility to work in your normal flow if you feel like it.
I would agree with that for sure. The number of times in my career where I've built what I would consider absolutely beautiful documentation and have it land with a thud with the intended audience. You know, it could be people prefer a little video snippet, could be guided clicks, could be written. So having another arrow in the quiver to deliver that type of enablement and to show people what's going on can only be a good thing in my mind.
I think it makes Marketo more accessible for people that have maybe cut their teeth in other platforms, which I love about it. And I think also from a perspective of, you know, accessibility, when I'm talking with an SFDC admin or somebody that's like, well, show me what's happening in Marketo, and I go in and I have to explain what we're seeing in each of the components of a smart campaign, their eyes glaze over. I've lost people. I could see them. They're just like, nope. Right. And I think that this is also more accessible for someone who's very technical, but maybe not Marketo technical.
I will also add that one of my like very OCD favorite things about it is that the visual lines snap straightly. So if you've ever worked in other tools where some of those canvases can turn into a spaghetti monster, and I won't name any names, they can be really hard to read. And from what I've seen in the engagement canvas, the smart campaign snaps to like straight lines and doesn't have any overlap. And you can't actually drag things around. It does that automatically. And I really like that. And that's just my OCD ops brain that's really excited about that tiny feature. Awesome. I think we probably have time for a couple more. I feel like we've mentioned workspaces and partitions a few times in a couple of our questions. I think namely talking a little bit about some of that product scoring that we went back to earlier. So I'm curious if folks want to elaborate on some of the pros and cons of workspaces and or partitions in various instances they've worked in.
Workspaces and partitions are like getting a tattoo. Make sure you really want it now and that you're going to want it 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. Once you get it, it is a lot of work and potentially very expensive to remove them.
Nicely said. But it's helpful to keep, I feel like I'm like swimming in workspaces and partitions right now, but in instances, but it is helpful to keep, like if you have a certain amount of users that you want to work on a certain area of marketing, like they have their little, it's not a sandbox, but they have their little area, their playground to play in. Things don't overlap and things can't really be referenced. Those people can't access bigger programs that exist in like the default workstation. It's great for stuff like that, but it does take some time to set up. You know, smart lists aren't referenced. So if you have any of those core smart lists that you're using every day in every campaign, you have to rebuild those in the other workspace. Yeah. But nicely said, Andy.
Yeah, I think to Andy's point, I think this is one of those scenarios where you should really try and exhaust everything you can in your core instance before you make that decision. Certainly there are conversations where salespeople will push you like, oh, well, you know, you can start from day one with these and it's plug and play. And that is absolutely not the case. It's the type of thing where no one's going to say no if you ask your rep to add them later. So it's much easier to start with your core instance and axe that to kind of its limits and then consider adding them in. To Andy's point, it's incredibly hard to rip them out once you've implemented them.
The one other thing that I'll layer in here is talk about what's driving you as an organization to have a conversation about workspaces and partitions. Do you have multiple businesses that are completely separate and differentiated in one Marketo instance? You have a business case for it. Are you trying to set up guardrails on who can access what, where? Is it actually a roles and permissions problem and you're trying to square peg round hole workspaces and partitions into having people in your system that you don't want to have access to certain things, but you don't have the control over that to get them to stay in the lines, so to speak, right? Because it's often used for that use case because there isn't necessarily a better way to do it. And so it's a good use case, but it's not what it was invented for. So I think that's one area to be careful of is why are we driving toward this? Is this a process problem we're trying to solve with technology? Or is this an actual categorization and separation of comms, you know, church and state that we need to have in order to do business?
I'll just finish one final point on that. And if you do, and you have all the business use cases in place and everything like that, then it is a requirement. I mean, again, training and enablement is so crucial when you have workspaces and partitions. I mean, you can, of course, like use roles and permissions for access and stuff, but there's a lot that can happen in there. So thinking through if you have a centralized or decentralized model of like who's even accessing Marketo, because when you enter complexities like workspaces and partitions, and you have a lot of field marketers in there, like trying to set up their own things and stuff like that, like there's just a lot more training and enablement I feel that needs to go in place, and you just need like a really strong ops team. So I would not try to take it on. It's not for the faint of heart unless you have all the, you know, appropriate things in place and you feel like you can support it.
If you ever go down that rabbit hole and someone says forced dupes or forced duplicates, we'll have a conversation with Brooke Bartos and she can help you figure out how to not go down that. What do we want to call that? I'll call it a rabbit hole, but it's darker and scarier and not a place you want to go.
Black hole, call it a black hole.
All right, we got 5 minutes left and we got 4 champs. So everyone gets like 1 minute and 20 seconds to answer the last question. which is, what is one hack, best practice, or something of the like that you think more people in the Marketo community should know? And let's go with Evan, because you came off mute first.
I think one of my favorites that I think a lot of people understand now, but maybe new people don't, is taking advantage of universal tokens. So one of the first things that you can do in an instance is set a parent level folder where you can add tokens that are going to flow down to all of the child folders and programs that fall underneath them. Some excellent use cases would be calendar year. It only takes you once of having to update 100 assets with a new calendar year to realize the power of universal tokens. Things that can change, like an office address. Anything that needs to be across assets in your entire instance, but could potentially change, is a good candidate for a universal token. And so I always like to set those up as one of the very first things in an instance. It's easy to do, it flows down, you don't have to worry about it. But once you do it once, it's there forever, and it will save you a ton of time in the one case that you have to use it.
I'll go next, rapid fire like. I'd say one of the first foundational like things too, or even if you've had your instance a while, is taking a look at your channels and program statuses and how they align to your Salesforce campaign types and campaign member statuses. I mean, getting that aligned and in check is key. But then I'm also just going to preach what I talked about earlier in really making your operational area efficient with executable campaigns.
I can go next. So one of my favorite hacks is in the line of channels. Anything that is not going to drive towards scoring, I go in, I create a hidden success step, make that my success, hide it, and then anything that I'm going to act off of if I'm looking for a success will only be those things that can drive towards scoring. If it's operational, life cycle, anything else that's not going to drive towards scoring, the success step is hidden because you got to have one. And then your actual active status is no success.
All right, Heather, bring us home. Heather, you got one?
I would say, oh gosh, there's lots that are coming to mind. I would say mostly, I really like the topic on executable campaigns. I feel like a lot of people need to know more about that. Those are very powerful and useful. I've been recently in dynamic chat and interactive webinar land. So I feel like really exploring those options. If you have Drift, if you're using On24 or Zoom or whatever you're using, explore the options that you have available in your instance now. We are doing the same thing, and it's working out really well. Yeah, that's really everything I can think of right now.
I want to add and close out with a non-technical one, which is just because something worked for somebody else and their use case doesn't mean it will solve your problem or work for your business use case. Think about everything in the context of your specific org and your specific business. I saw a great one about a person who hasn't ever had lead scoring work for them, and lead scoring is a super common topic and people talk about it a lot, but if it's not moving the needle for your business, think about alternatives. I think that's an underrated one in the non-technical space. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us for July office hours. I had a great time, and I hope you all got some really incredible knowledge.